What happened to Tori after she went skiing alone and never came back? Was she really dead? And why did Ben accuse his sister of murdering Tori? What will happen next in this chilling story? Hey there! Are you ready for some spine-chilling horror stories? Subscribe now and join us on this terrifying journey. My best friend, Tori, slept with my brother Ben during our big ski weekend last year. I was so upset. I warned Tori that my brother was off limits. There were so many other guys at the lodge, eligible bachelors and whatever. Why did she have to sleep with my brother? I felt like she stabbed me in the back. We got into a really big argument and I told her that I never wanted to see her again, and guess what, I didn't, because that afternoon she went out skiing alone and never came back when she left. The weather was perfect, but things changed very quickly and she got caught in some kind of snowstorm. We all assumed that she died, but they never found the body. This all happened last winter and I'm still not over it. I feel so guilty that our last conversation was such a terrible argument. When my boyfriend Steve suggested another ski trip exactly 1 year after Tori's disappearance, I thought the idea was terrible. How could we have fun with the memory of Tori's death looming over us the whole trip? So I said no. I said under no circumstances would I want to go back to the same ski lodge. There was just too many bad memories. I thought Steve understood how I felt. He was always so supportive, but he said that he was still going to go without me. I tried not to be upset, even though I kind of was. I felt like Steve was betraying Tori's memory too. And then my brother Ben called me up and changed my mind. He explained how guilty he felt over Tori's death, because he was the one who caused the argument in the first place. He was the reason that she went out into the snowstorm without me. I hadn't realized that Ben felt guilty, as I did. He explained that the reunion trip would be the best way for him to overcome that guilt, and hearing this logic from him made me reevaluate things. Maybe this would be a good trip. Maybe it would help me get some closure. So I called Steve and told him that I'd changed my mind. That weekend, we packed our bags, piled into Ben's SUV, and headed up to the ski lodge. The place looked exactly the same. It really was a beautiful lodge, wooden, spacious and rustic. The snow-covered peaks were gorgeous. On that first days, Steve and I hit the bunny slopes, while Ben and his other friends hit the harder peaks. I tried to enjoy myself. I really did, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tori. We all got back into the lodge that evening. We were sitting by the fire. Ben was filming himself on his phone. Some of his friends were into it and a couple weren't. I guess he'd spent all day filming himself for TikTok. His whole speech about feeling guilty was just BS. He just wanted us all to come back here, so he can make videos about moving on after tragedy. He was using the anniversary of Tori's death to get more followers. Steve and I were sitting by the fire when Ben walked directly towards us while talking into his phone. He was live streaming and he was going to make us be a part of it too. Hey guys, tell the world how you're feeling right now. I covered my face with my hand and looked away. Steve was a bit more diplomatic. He looked into Ben's phone and said, "We're fine. Thank you." With as much finality as he could, Ben got the hint and scurried off. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day was even worse. Ben filmed everything we did and worse, he kept following me and Steve around with his phone throughout the day. He posted clips of us skiing and sipping cocoa. He added sad music and captions like "moving on" or "honoring her memory." He wasn't a lot of his videos, but more and more of them were just of me and Steve, but mostly me. I kept telling him to stop, but he refused. He said he was doing this for Tori. I wanted to punch him. At the end of the day, Steve and I were ready to head back inside and put our ski stuff away. When Ben ran over, he asked if I wanted to do one more trip up the mountain. I told him no, he just wanted more footage of me. Then let's make a deal. He said if we go up one more time, I promise I will never film you again. It seemed like some kind of trick, but I knew that my brother never went back on his word. If I did this, he'd stop making everything so awkward. So I agreed. Steve asked if he could come with us, but I knew he was just being supportive. He was already exhausted and his knee was bugging him. I told him that I'd be okay, and then he left. Ben and I took a ski lift up to the mountain, where we were high up in the air. He took out his phone and started live streaming. Hey guys, it's Ben again. I'm here with my sister. She's the one in all those videos having an absolute blast, even though it's the anniversary of when she murdered Tori, the love of my life. Before the meaning of his words fully sank in, he turned the phone camera towards me. Say hi to the world. Now's your chance to finally come clean. I think you have to, because if you don't, he started wildly rocking our ski lift. I had to grab the bar. What are you doing? I screamed. He didn't answer. Instead, he just held the phone in my face, filming me close up all this time. My brother blamed me for Tor's death. He thought I murdered her, and this whole trip was an elaborate way for me to make me confess publicly. I didn't kill her. I screamed. He rocked the ski lift even harder. We still had at least a minute before we reached the top of the mountain. Tell the truth. He said I didn't kill her. He screamed at me, kicked me with his foot. He went into a rage, kicking and kicking me until I'd plummet off to my death. I wrapped both my arms around the bar. He kicked me one more time, but I twisted to the side just as his foot was about to hit my thigh. He was pushing so hard that he lost the grip on the bar and slid off. I watched in horror, as my brother fell hundreds of feet to the snowy ground below. His phone was in his hand the whole time, filming everything. My brother never got the confession that he wanted, but at least he went viral. Steve and I had a long silent ride home. Last month my boyfriend Juan took me on a camping trip in California. Camping really isn't my thing, but I knew he wanted to go. When he's happy, I'm happy. Besides, he seemed kind of anxious when he brought it up. The trip clearly meant something to him, so I could only assume that he was going to finally propose. We parked near the ranger station and picked up a couple of maps. The ranger warned us about places to stay away from, but Ju assured him that we'd be fine, and then we started hiking. I hated it. I hated every second of it. Even though I bought the right shoes from an outdoor supply store. My feet were throbbing in pain. I needed constant breaks. I was always out of breath, and Onion just kept talking. He had all the energy in the world, and it felt like he was purposely ignoring how difficult it was for me. We gotten pretty high up the first mountain, and I desperately needed to sit down. I asked Juan if we could take a break now. He looked around for a while and then said, "Yeah, this is a good spot." We were on a relatively flat area toward the top of the mountain, and had a beautiful view of the valley below. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out the tent. "You set this up and I'll go gather firewood." I really didn't know how to pitch a tent, but at least I didn't have to stand up while I was doing it. Before he left, he sprayed me with some anti-bear spray just in case it smelled awful, but at least it didn't get in my eyes. By the time I finished pitching the tent, Onion still hadn't returned. I started to get a little nervous, even though we couldn't get cell reception out here. I needed to grab my phone and see what time it was. He had to have been gone at least an hour, but when I reached into my backpack my phone was gone. So was W. He'd taken them both when he left, but I looked through the whole backpack and I saw that the maps were gone too. So was our food and water. There was only one explanation. He left me behind. He wanted me to get lost out there. I was furious. I looked around the campsite, but there was no sign of him. I needed to get back down to the ranger station before dark, but I didn't know which direction to go in. While coming up here, One had purposely changed paths a couple of times now. I knew why. At the very least, I knew that I needed to go downhill. I didn't bother bringing anything with me. I left the whole tent where it was. It was a lot easier to walk downhill. I didn't feel as sore. Of course, I was also driven by anger by the afternoon. I felt like I'd been walking forever. I was starting to lose hope until I saw a large man up ahead. He was leaning against a tree, but I couldn't see his face through the leaves. "Hey," I called out as I sped up to reach him. The man turned to look at me and I almost screamed. It wasn't a man at all. It was a bear. I stood frozen, too afraid to move. I silently prayed that the anti-bear spray would drive it away. Unfortunately, it did the exact opposite. The bear sniffed a few times and then it went absolutely wild. It charged at me roaring. That's when I knew the full extent of my boyfriend's plan. He hadn't just abandoned me in the wilderness. He had sprayed me with some spray that attracted bears, not repelled them. He wanted me to get eaten, and soon I would be. I kept running as fast as I could, but the bear was catching up. There was nothing I could do to stop it. Just as it swiped its claw at me, I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped off the cliff. I fell through the air almost in slow motion and struck the tops of trees. I felt the worst pain of my life as my body hit branch after branch during my fall. By the time I'd landed on the ground, I was unconscious from the pain, but at least the bear couldn't get me. I'm not sure how long I was passed out on the ground, probably not too long. I woke up to a young couple standing over me. The boyfriend was gently shaking my shoulder. It took a while for my eyes to focus. "Are you okay?" the girlfriend asked. "No," I grumbled. "I just jumped off a cliff to avoid getting eaten by a bear." She asked. I was in way too much pain to keep talking to these people. I told them to call the police instead of asking me all these questions. Now that we were out of the mountains and close to the ranger station, their cell phones could get enough bars to make a call. We already called them. The man admitted after we saw the other person. I didn't know who they were talking about. At first I struggled to stand up. The man tried to stop me because I was pretty hurt from the fall, but with their help I was able to stand and limp back toward the ranger station. Took only 5 minutes to get there, even though we were going at a really slow pace. The ambulance was already waiting. Someone was lying dead on the stretcher. I didn't need to see his face to know that it was Onion. He was the body that they'd found. I got closer just to make sure I recognized his face, or at least the top half. The bottom half, just below his nose, had been torn off. I couldn't stop myself from laughing at the irony. Juan had sprayed me with some chemical to attract bears, and yet he was the one to get killed by one. The last time I saw him, he was kissing me goodbye after he'd sprayed me with the chemical. Served him right after that. The ambulance took me to the hospital to patch me up. I'm okay now, but I still have nightmares about that forest. I will never go camping again. My name is Tanya and I'm an elementary school teacher. For the last year I've worked at a pretty dysfunctional charter school. It was run by a woman named Janice. She started the school just before the pandemic, and most of the staff were her family members. I was the only non-relative working for her, and she treated me like garbage. Because all the other teachers were in her family. They did whatever she wanted. But because I'd been a public school teacher for most of my adult life, I knew that a lot of her decisions were just wrong. I pushed back against her a lot, but always because I wanted the best for our students. When Janice announced a school field trip to Grapevine Canyon, I was surprised that she chose me as one of the chaperone. I agreed to go. Of course, I love taking students on field trips, especially if they got to see nature. The bus arrived at the canyon and I was in charge of half the students, while Janice was in charge of the rest. Most of the students in her group were related to her. It was a really fun trip. We got to see some ancient Native American petroglyphs plus some really cool rock formations. The kids seemed to really enjoy it. As we made it back to the bus, Janice's students all came up to me. "Miss Tanya," one of them said, "we can't find Miss Janice." It was Parker, one of Janice's nephews, and he sounded really nervous. I told all of the kids to wait on the bus, while I went back into the canyon to look for her. I was very annoyed. Janice had broken the one rule of field trips. She'd left her students behind and gotten lost. I looked everywhere for her, but I couldn't find her. I headed back to the bus, hoping that she'd found her way back, but the bus was gone. They'd left without me. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but I didn't have any reception, and a situation like this, I knew the best thing to do was stay put and wait for the bus to come back. It didn't. I was so angry, but I was starting to get nervous too. Eventually, I saw a white van drive toward me. A man was in the driver's seat. I'd never seen him before. He parked in front of me and asked what I was doing here alone. I explained that my school had left me here, and he scolded me for wandering off by myself. I wasn't in the mood for a lecture, especially because this was Janice's fault, not mine, so I just stood there and listened to him go off. But as he was talking, I noticed that his tone of voice sounded a lot like Janice's. When I looked into his steely blue eyes, I noticed that they looked a lot like Janice's eyes. I wasn't certain, but I had a strong feeling that he was one of Janice's relatives too. When he was done lecturing me, he told me to hop in so he could drive me back to town. I didn't trust him, so I asked one question: "Where are you from?" He looked at me confused and said New Jersey. Why? Janice was from New Jersey. That was all the proof I needed. This guy was definitely her relative, which meant that there was something fishy going on. As a teacher, I always came prepared because we were out in the wild. I brought pepper spray with me. I got close to his open window and sprayed him right in the face. He screamed out in pain, distracting him long enough for me to reach in and pull his keys out of the ignition. I demanded to know what was going on. He wouldn't answer, so I sprayed him again, as he desperately wiped his face. He told me that he was Jay, his brother. Their whole family wanted to get rid of me, so he was going to take me somewhere deep in the desert, kill me and then hide my body so that everyone thought I'd gotten lost in the canyon. At least that's what I think he said. He was really struggling to talk through all the pain. I opened the door, pulled him out of the van and shoved him onto the gravel. Then I hopped in, stuck in the keys and drove off. When I got back into town, I drove straight to the police station. I saw the school bus parked outside. All the kids were gone, but the driver was still there. He was Janice's cousin. I snuck past making sure he didn't see me, and then I walked into the waiting room. All the students were sitting in the lobby. When they saw me, they jumped out of their seats and gave me a big group hug. I asked what was going on and they said that Miss Janice was talking to the police about my disappearance. They pointed toward a door behind them. I told the kids to sit back down and stay quiet because I'm a good teacher. They did what I said. I reached the door, which was open just a crack. I could hear the conversation inside. Janice was telling the police how I had left my students behind to wander around the canyon and I disappeared. Parker, Janice's little nephew, was there too. He agreed with her story. She'd obviously told him what to say. The policeman said he'd sent out his men to start searching for me. That's when I pushed open the door and walked inside. No need, I told the policeman, I'm safe, but you might need to send someone down there to help Janice's brother. He tried to kidnap me, so I pepper sprayed him and left him there. Janice and Parker stared at me horrified. The charter school closed down after that and I went back to teaching at a public school. Public schools have a lot of problems too, but nothing compares to my time at that charter school. Janice and most of her family are in jail. Now it's what they deserve. Look, girl, I've got a 100 if you show me your, he said to me, and everything else fell numb to my hearing. The entire Mardi Gras festival, which been one big escape for me from the drag of my desk job, suddenly stopped being fun. I watched the colors up close, but it all seemed like a shade of gray, dull and unimpressive, just like the smiles and the partying. I didn't want to show a man. I didn't know my body. He had a curious face. His head was so bald it was shiny, but he maintained a full blonde beard with a mustache so long it covered his mouth. His eyes were brown and his dilated pupils, in contrast with the rest of his whites, made him look a darker shade. "No, you creepy ass," I blurted, turned around and muttered a cuss word under my breath, as I continued to scan the crowd for my friends. I looked this way and that and up the crowd, and just there I saw a familiar hat. I drifted in that direction through the jungle of partying bodies that had become sticky with sweat. I had dismissed him in my head, and for all intent, I had imagined he was gone when I walked away from him. Like many of the other creeps at the festival, slipping through the bodies that moved like an animated maze soon tired me out, and I turned my direction instead towards the sidewalk. I climbed the sidewalk and marched briskly towards the hat from where I stood to where I wanted to go, exactly where I had left my friends. There was an alley. I had no idea about this until I felt such strong hands come from behind to seize my arm, forcing me into the corner. I was stunned when I turned around, and there he was, the creepy stranger with the shiny bald head and blonde mustache. He pulled me so forcefully that I could not speak through the silence. That was my confusion. The crowd around us turned their attention to us, and before I could speak, he spoke first to their inquiring gaze. "She stole something from me. Can you believe this?" he muttered, and the crowd suddenly backed away. If I was not immediately scared to my pants of this stranger's overwhelming bulk of size and the danger he posed, I too would be impressed by how expertly he manipulated the entire situation. I moaned in protest, but the crowd shrugged me away and continued with their march. "Now listen here," he said, grinding his teeth. He recoiled his hips and pressed a knife to the side of my abdomen, where the crowd could not see. "You will smile at the pass in carnival, and shimmy off until I get my release if I like it. I won't tear your belly open." My head spun. It was as though I were an onlooker in my own violation, but in that moment, it was not that which worried me. It was the horror of his knife in my stomach, tearing my stomach open while I bleed to death. The possibility of him mingling with the large crowd and escape was not beyond thinking. Fear crippled me, and I whimpered an apology to him, asking him to not hurt me. He pressed his knife a little into my flesh, and I looked. I quivered like a leaf on a breezy evening, flowing with a rash gut that I could neither contain nor understand. The knife was sharp, deadly steel, and the menace in this stranger's eyes betrayed a willingness to use it on me. It was all the warning I needed. Tears veiled my eyes. My body yearned for salvation. As day turned to bleak night in the pool of my teary eyes, I was terrified for my life, and it caused my chest to open up. I could scarcely breathe. The numbness of all my senses peaked. I struggled to keep myself standing up on my feet, even as my knees buckled. The sensations in my head manifested into the outer world, and I saw the world itself spinning round and around the core of my terror. "I've killed people for less disrespect," he said, as he pressed the knife even further. My lips parted, and before I could speak, he proved it by jabbing his knife into my flesh, puncturing me to reveal a thin blooded stream that ran down his blade. I gasped in the shock of watching myself bleed. "You make any loud noise and I make the WB bigger. Do as I tell you, and I might let you live," he whispered to me, pressing me against the wall. "These lot won't even notice your dead body until the cops come for it. You'd be just another accident." I reached my hands to grab him slowly, just as had asked me to. My stomach roiled with revulsion, and every second that I was there held against my will, with the tip of a knife pressed into the side of my stomach while the Mardi Gras festival went on by felt like hellish torture. My body struggled to absorb it. I felt warm from within my body, burning up with dread-induced fever. It did not offend my senses that I was being in the open as much as the thought that other festival goers were passing by without stopping, because those before them had not stopped. One of the best weeks of my life had quickly dipped into a nightmare. The tears in my eyes bead and streaked down my face as I choked on my scream for help, knowing that meant being stabbed. Thoughts raced through my mind at a mind-bending pace. Bring it out. He commanded me. I obeyed him and my world froze. I did not see David through the film of tears in my hat. Not even his fancy beads and his hat slipped into my consciousness, as I was totally detached from the horrifying experience with the stranger. All I saw was a heavy fist flying at the speed of light, whooshing past my face and landing on the side of the stranger's ears. The collision of David's fist and the stranger's skull sounded like an explosion had just gone off. The stranger's body was flat out on the ground. "Becca, did he hurt you?" David asked, managing his attention between me and the stranger. The marching stopped and a crowd from the festival stopped to see what was happening. I whispered what had happened to Dave through tears, and he pulled me in for a hug, assuring me I was safe from the terrifying episode. In a matter of minutes the cops arrived, even though I had no clarity of mind to know when they had been called. My testimony was taken and the stranger was placed under arrest. Then I went home promising myself that it will take a lot to get me to go for another Mardi Gras. It all started when Jack was explaining his mom's favorite movie. It starred Natalie Portman. She acted as a pregnant lady who lived in a Walmart. The boys and I were playing video games talking about it over our headsets. They all chirped about how unrealistic it was that someone could get away with living in any store. "I totally think we could do it." Jack said. Our friends strongly disagreed. They insisted that they had 24-hour surveillance and that the cops would come right. When we crawled out of our hiding spot, my interest was piqued. I told them no, I agree with Jack. I think we could do it. They probably don't have someone watching the cameras overnight, and I doubt anyone will check the footage. I worked in a grocery store, so I figured Walmart and a grocery store would have some similar practices. The boys howled in disagreement. They dared us to try. If we succeeded and stayed overnight at a Walmart, they would pay us each $100. Honestly, I thought it was going to be chump change. The next day Jack and I got to work. We started by watching the Natalie Portman movie to see what she did. Even if it is fiction, we thought we could still learn a thing or two. Then we scoped out our local Walmart for hiding spots. They didn't have a tent like the one Natalie hid in, but we discovered we could fit in the wardrobes in the furniture section. Jack is short and thin, so like an acrobat, he fit himself into one of the larger dresses. Maybe we should have done more inspecting, but we felt like those hiding spots were foolproof. We updated our friends and they all laughed that we were actually going to go through with it for $1,100 in this economy. Absolutely, I responded. One of our friends said we could tell our parents we were sleeping over at his place. We waited until about 10 p.m. to go into the store because it closed. At 11 we walked around with a cart, acting like we were shopping. At 10:45 we abandoned the cart and tucked ourselves away in the furniture. Through the crack of the wardrobe I saw a worker take our discarded cart. I held my breath, scared I would be found out, but the worker paid me no mind. They grabbed the cart and continued without a second thought. Relief washed over me. We heard them switch off the big lights at about 11:40. We waited a while more before crawling out to ensure the coast was clear. We stretched our legs and looked at each other. Jack said, "So what do we do now?" One thing we hadn't planned for was how dull it would be. Sitting around looking at our phones felt like a waste. So we started Ed to explore. We roamed the aisles and were honestly bored out of our minds. Let's go to the back rooms, I suggested. When I first started working at the grocery store, I thought it was so cool to go through the swinging doors to the area that was forbidden to customers. That was a small grocery store, and this was a massive Walmart. Jack loved the idea. We made our way to the back of the store when we heard what sounded like a door shut. Our heads snapped in different directions, and we looked for the source of the noise. "Did you hear that?" Jack whispered. I nodded. Maybe it was an air duct or something. That idea put us at ease, so we continued. We pushed through the swinging doors to the back. Jack had a big grin on his face. Now we were having fun. It was so dark in the back that we debated turning on a light, but we thought it was too risky. We used our phones to light our way. Sure enough, the back was massive, much bigger than the grocery store instead of plastic walls. It was concrete. There were 3 rows of large silver shelves and piles of boxes in the corners. As we weaved through the forbidden aisles, we heard a steady scraping sound. We froze and looked at each other. I put my index finger to my lips to signal him to remain quiet. I was trying to tell where the sound was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from one of the other aisles. I have no idea what that could be. I whispered to Jack, "Let's maybe get out of here." "Yeah, that sounds good to me." Jack followed close behind me as the scraping sound continued right as we reached the swinging doors. Jack spoke up. I looked behind me to see why Jack suddenly stopped talking, but he was no longer behind me. "Jack," I whispered. "Jack, this isn't funny. Come out." I realized the scraping sound stopped. I listened for footsteps, breaths, anything that could reveal where Jack disappeared to, but I heard nothing. "Brian!" Jack yelled from somewhere in the back. The sound echoed off the concrete walls and I had no idea where it was coming from. "Jack!" I yelled back. "Where are you?" Jack yelled my name again, but this time it was shriller and more urgent. I found the light switch and flipped on the lights. Now I could see, but I still couldn't see him. "I'm coming, Jack." I yelled back, no response, but I thought I heard a lad chuckle. I weaved through the aisles looking for him. When I saw something in my stomach dropped. "Jack?" I said. As I slowly approached him around the corner, I found Jack on the ground barely breathing. There was a huge gash on his stomach. Jack reached for me. He started talking, but he was strained. "There's a man," he said weakly. His eyes widened and he began pointing at something behind. I turned around and saw a man dragging an axe. He reminded me of Freddy Krueger, but he didn't have scars or knives for hands, but he did have a devilish grin on his face. "Who are you?" he asked slowly. I hesitated. "Brian." His smile grew wider. He lifted his axe and began to swing, but I dodged it. When it came down, I stood up and looked at Jack. He motioned for me to go. I couldn't leave him behind. I hoisted him up by taking one of his arms around my shoulder. The man prepared to swing again, but Jack and I shuffled away. "Why isn't he running after us?" I asked Jack. He was in too much pain to respond. We headed towards the swinging doors. I could hear him dragging his axe behind us. I tried to move faster, but I could only move so fast with Jack injured. I headed towards the aisle with the bandages and rubbing alcohol so we could bandage Jack up until he could get some real medical help. I listened for the axe, but I could no longer hear it. Probably didn't make as much noise on the softer floors. We made it to the bandages and I started to put pressure on his gash. I didn't really know what to do, but in the movie they always say put pressure on it. So I went with that. "Oh Brian," I heard the X-Man sing. My heart stopped. He sounded close right as he was about to turn the corner. A couple of cops and a Walmart manager came walking down the aisle. It was like the Axeman evaporated at the sight of them. He disappeared into the shadows. If it weren't for the Axeman, I would have been furious at my friends for riding us out to the police. Thankfully, they saved our lives because they couldn't afford to give us each 100. Jack survived. He needed a lot of stitches and a blood transfusion, but the cops found us just in time. We explained what happened and they searched that Walmart from top to bottom looking for that man, but they didn't find anyone. We gave them a character description and the cops said they would contact us if they learned anything. They never did. The case went unsolved, but Jack and I survived. Later in life I learned that I couldn't shop at Walmart because it triggered me, so I only shop at Target. Now the rain hammered outside Walmart like the fury of 1,000 dwarfs storming a fort, and my heart mimicked the beat of its THS, as I did my work. It was work that I had done time and time again, so much so that I'm sure I could do it with my eyes closed. But there was a problem with being so bored with the tasks of filling row with products that made me absent-minded once, like a sudden rallying cry to a running force. The thunder in the sky would rumble loud after the rain, and it would awaken my senses. I would quiver, look around then fall back into my task. I had gone about halfway through my shift for the night and in between my distraction, I had hope for some excitement. I had no idea that the forces of the world would have a way to answer my prayer so soon, but it was no more than a minute after I had said my prayer that I heard the shelf behind me creak, as if though someone leaned on it. I was startled, and as I turned around to see what the problem was, my eyes were met with that of a stranger with a basket in his hand. I was in my Walmart uniform, so it was not unusual that he would be comfortable with seeing me, but he did some bizarre thing that should have tickled my senses. He stopped between the shelves and glared at me like a specimen. He found amusing. I watched him through the corner of my eyes, and it made me uneasy that he paused in his stance like a mannequin when I lifted my head from the task. He was still there and he was staring at me with his head fixed and only his eyes moved. He was drenched from the crown of his head to his shoes. His hair was so thin that the water slicked his TFT to his scalp. It was pale, beat by the rain, until it appeared as though he was drained of his blood, almost as white as snow. One look at him, and he had such a strong image that it took only once to be impressed by the mind. His face was defined, eyes sunken and black. The nose on his face was long, with an aristocratic aspect to his features that made him appear as though he arrogantly hung in the air. His lips were pink, in contrast to the rest of his face. "Hello," I stammered to break the uneasy icy confrontation that was between us. "Do you need something?" Of course he needed something. I blew air through the roof of my mouth. It was why he came to the shop, but he didn't answer. He just stared until what felt like moved from being a simple concern to a streak of anxiousness. I searched deeper into his eyes and I noticed a thin film of coating on his eyes. As one were on the brink of tears. I struggled for relief, looking for the next person to walk by the shelf that would offer help. "I'm sorry I have to leave," I said politely when I noticed he wouldn't say anything. I strolled towards him to take his side out of the aisle. It was a stupid mistake on my part, and I only realized it when he held my hands and pulled me to himself with such force that it rocked me. The maneuver to get me to rest my back on his broad chest was from someone who was very skilled in it, because I could barely resist his strong arm and the grip of it around my throat. I was suddenly desperate for escape as soon as I was in his hands, but a scalpel flashed purposely across my face and I froze. He pressed it to the small of my back and leaned into my ears. Terror seized all my senses, and even though I was aware of my surroundings, I suffered from being unable to process any of it. His tears landed on my shoulder and instead of sobbing as I expected, he was cackling. I was confused, as I was terrified. The horror of what this strange quirky man would do to me made me queasy. My stomach roiled and tumbled aching all the way to my lower stomach. "Please, I beg you, let me go." I whimpered as I struggled to hold myself together while the blade that threatened to disembowel me was still on me, but he was still laughing at least for a minute more before he spoke. She begged too. You know my beautiful Georgina, he said, and he teased the blade up my back, snagging the sharp edges of my Walmart uniform. I did not particularly enjoy my job on most days, but on that day I simply wished I didn't work at all. My life was in the hands of a stranger, with no one coming to help me. I gulped a hard ball of saliva, and my tears from my eyes sliced over my cheeks, and they fell into my open mouth. I can't escape it. You don't understand. I'm going to the chair. They'll kill me when they find me. He laughed as hard as he could, but before they kill me, I'll kill you, just like I killed the others. My mind was so slow to interpret everything that I was struggling to put the pieces of what was happening together, as I sensed us being surrounded. My relief was halfway drawn when I saw the police. I realized in that moment just how much danger I was in. I was unsure at what moment I had slipped into a nightmare, but I wanted to be away from the horse so much that I began to say prayers, the same prayers that my grandmother would say, "Let her go, Rodriguez." The burly cop, with a gun in his hand, leaned into the shelf on the right. The other cops made a semicircle around the edge of the shelf, with her guns drawn. My prayers intensified because I was in the middle of it on. I was the pawn, my heart drummed against my chest cage, and I was dizzy by how forceful the sheer terror made me. Then he started to talk, and the more he spoke of what he'd done, bragged about how his victims begged, like his beautiful Georgina, had begged him before he killed her, the more hysterical he got. He got into such a mad fit that he entrapped me into his horribly twisted mind before he did the strangest thing. He poked the knife into the side of my stomach, and the pain of the scalpel puncturing my stomach shook my body. I let out a loud cry of pain and the gunshot went off. I was all I saw before I fainted. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. I was told by officers that Rodriguez was killed. They confronted him after they got a tip that he was a serial killer. Thanks for being part of our horror community. Subscribe to continue the fright.